Hello everyone, my name is Sam Gomez and I welcome you to this presentation which is part of the festive Tech Calendar 2022. If this is the first presentation that you've come across as part of this event, I invite you to check out all the other amazing content that my fellow presenters have put out there. This presentation is titled Letters to Santa, Automating Text Extraction with Azure Cognitive Services. Fun facts about me: I'm originally from Mexico. I am currently a tech lead at a company called Jenica, a small consulting company out of Chicago. And when I'm not working on technology or development or anything like that, I love spending time with my family. I have a wife and 2 kids. I love watching movies, playing video games, and also anything soccer related. I love watching, I love playing. I coach my 5-year-old soccer team, so I'm very passionate about that. You can connect with me through Twitter at @thesoccerdev. You can also go to my GitHub repo where you can find the code that you will see today as well as the slides. And I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. If you have any questions about any of the services or anything that you see today, please feel free to reach out. I'll be more than happy to help. Santa is a busy guy, right? Especially in this month with reading letters, making the toys, getting everything ready for the trip, also popping out at shopping malls to figure out what kids want. Him and his elves are swamped. So, what if we could help him a little bit with the letter part of it, the reading the letters part of it? So, what we're going to try to do in this solution is we're going to extract the text from the letters. We're going to detect the sentiment of those letters. So we're going to try to figure out if the person writing that letter maybe is going through a hard time, if maybe they're sad, maybe there's a little bit extra attention that Santa needs to pay to a particular letter. And also we're going to try to do a little bit of pre-processing with the letters. So we're going to try to see if we can figure out what is it that the kids are asking from Santa, so that we can speed up that process and maybe help out to send those toys over to the assembly line to get built. So what is our solution going to look like from an architecture perspective? So it's all going to start with letters being scanned. So there's going to be a scanning of letters. We're going to have some images of those letters. They are going to be dropped into an Azure Blob storage container. That blob storage, or there's going to be a trigger that is actually going to trigger an Azure function. And that Azure function is going to do a couple different things. Number one, it's going to create a record in a Cosmos database that Santa can then look in a dashboard application. So after the letters have been processed, he's going to be able to go into that application, look at the image of the letter, and look at the text that we extracted as well. The other thing that the Azure function is going to do, it's going to call some cognitive services APIs. And this is where all the magic happens. So this is where we're going to spend a little bit more time on. So there's going to be 3 different things that we're going to do. So number one, we're going to extract the text using OCR. So we're going to use the Vision API for that. And then we're going to use part of the language APIs to do entity recognition, which is what's going to allow us to do the pre-processing to try to figure out what is it that the person is asking Santa for. And then we're going to do the sentiment analysis to, like I said, try to figure out if some of these letters need a little bit extra attention from Santa. Another big important piece that we're going to look at is the Azure App Configuration. This is what the Azure function and also the website are using to manage the configuration values. So we're not going to be using configuration files. Everything is going to be up in Azure. Now I'm going to touch base on all of these products very briefly. Like I said, most of the time we're going to spend talking about Azure Cognitive Services, what they can do. But I just want to go through some of these services in case that you are not familiar with them. First of all is the Azure Blob Storage, which is a solution that is optimized to store unstructured data, like images in our case, perfect for it, audio and video, log files, and you can use it to store backups and that you can use to then restore your system or your databases, for example. There's different access tiers that you can configure for your files. So for example, hot, cool, and archive. So depending on how often you are planning to access that data, you can store it in all those different tiers, and that will affect the cost of storing that information. So it's very important that you keep that in mind when you create those resources and when you access them. What kind of access tier do you want? All these services, there's a link on the bottom right-hand corner where you can go to the documentation for these services in case you want to check it out later. Azure Functions is the next piece of our system. This is a serverless compute solution that Azure offers. It's one of the different serverless compute solutions. And you can have different triggers for your functions. So your function can start as a result of a blob trigger, which is what we're going to use in our example. You can also do it as DB changes. So if there's something that needs to happen, if data changes in your database, you can do that as well. You can do scheduled tasks if you need to run a particular process at a certain amount of time. And you can also use it to analyze IoT data streams, because the Azure functions only run or are only activated on certain instances. They're perfect to analyze things like IoT data streams. Very important to keep in mind is that the model that you're going to use is going to affect your pricing. So you want to make sure that you don't have long-running functions that can really affect the price of your resources. You can create your functions in different languages. So obviously C#, but you can also use Java, JavaScript, and Python. Next resource is Azure Cosmos DB. This is the NoSQL database offering for Azure. So compared to SQL Server, this is a non-structured, a schema-less database. So you don't have to worry about having to change the schema of your database. It is high performing and scalable, which is ideal for web applications. And there's multiple APIs available to access Azure Cosmos DB. So you have NoSQL, which is native to Azure Cosmos. You have MongoDB, you have Cassandra, and you also have Gremlin. So if you're using graph data, for example, you have that Gremlin API. What this allows you to do is that if you already have applications that are using MongoDB, for example, you can take your data out of MongoDB, put it in Azure Cosmos, and the APIs allow your application in some instances to work without having to make any changes, or sometimes just make minimal changes to be able to use Azure Cosmos DB. NoSQL has an asterisk next to it because that is native to Azure Cosmos DB. But like I said, there's all those other APIs that you can use as well. Next, Azure App Configuration. As I mentioned, this is a cloud service for configuration management. What this allows you to do is to decouple your configuration and code. If you're using files for configuration, you know that every time that you build your application, your configuration is also going to go in there. So what this allows you to do is you have those completely separate. You can manage them separately. So any check-ins, there's no risk of making changes to your configuration or accidentally checking changes to your configuration every time you build your code, because they're completely isolated. Key features is that it's centralized. So like in this example, you're going to see that both the Azure function and the dashboard application, they're going to the same instance of Azure App Configuration. The complements Key Vault. So if you already are using Key Vault to store your secrets, you can access those secrets from Azure App Configuration without any problems. Dynamic configuration, which is one of the coolest things, the coolest features that this service has, is that you can make changes to your configuration. And if you have everything set up on your application, you don't need to rebuild and redeploy your application to see those configuration changes reflected on your application. Finally, you can also do feature flag management. If that's something that you're currently managing in your application, you can use Azure App Configuration to do that. Now, to the main event, or the main product that I really want to talk about, Azure Cognitive Services. These are APIs that allow you to add AI functionality to your applications. So what this allows you to do is that if you do not have the data or the resources to create your own machine learning models, you can just use Azure Cognitive Services APIs to create applications that can do OCR, for example, extract text from images. You can also analyze images. You can also do anomaly detection, speech to text, text to speech, many different functionalities that you can use just by calling an API. They're very easy to integrate with because there's available SDKs in different languages. So for example, C#, Java, Go, and Python are some examples of the languages that are available. One thing to note though is that not all these services have those SDKs. So some of them you actually have to call as if it was any other RESTful API, but still, for the ones that do have those SDKs available, it's really, really easy to use. Another really great thing is that they all have free tier, or most of these services have a free tier that you can use to experiment, to build a proof of concepts, to figure out if the services are going to work for what you're trying to do. So it's a great thing. It's a great tool. Very, very fun to play around. There's 4 different categories of APIs that you have in Azure Cognitive Services. So you have speech, language, vision, and decision. So speech is anything that is related with allowing your applications to interact using speech. So speech to text, text to speech, language, which allows you to do anything from translation, and is one of the APIs that we're going to use. Vision, analyzing images and video. And finally, decision, which is the group of APIs that contains the functionality to do anomaly detection, for instance, content moderation, and so on and so forth. So the Vision API, there's 3 different products or 3 different APIs that are part of this category. So we have computer vision, which allows you to do image analysis. So you can feed an image to computer vision and it will tell you if there's people in the picture, what objects there are in the picture, if there are any landmarks, things like that. And you also have the OCR, which allows you to extract text from images. So again, you feed an image to the API and the API returns any text that it can find in the application. Custom vision is the other API that is available. So if computer vision, if the out-of-the-box functionality is not enough for your case, you can create a custom vision model. So it's a middle ground between creating something totally from scratch because you still don't have access to the algorithm behind the scenes. You only feed your data to custom vision and it creates a model, creates an API that you can then use on your application. And then we also have Face API. So Face API allows you to do things like compare if 2 images, if 2 faces belong to the same person. This Face API is a little bit more restricted as part of the efforts from Microsoft to have more ethical AI. So if you do want to use the Face API, there's a little bit more settings. There's a little bit more that you have to do to enable that. But again, it could be useful if your scenario or your case, your business case requires to do face comparison or anything face related. The other API, the group of APIs or category of APIs that we're going to use in this application is the language API. So the 2 that we're going to use is entity recognition and sentiment analysis. As I mentioned when we were talking about the architecture, entity recognition is going to allow us to identify the product. So anything that has a product type category, we're going to extract that and store it as if that is what the person is asking Santa for. Sentiment analysis is going to allow us to determine if there is any kind of negative sentiment to the letter, and we're going to be able to flag that letter and show that flag on the dashboard that Santa is going to use. The other APIs that are available is question answering. So you can create a knowledge base for creating, for example, a frequently asked questions page. language understanding, which is an API that you would use, for example, if you were building a chatbot. You can use that language understanding to determine and process the input from your users and try to take action based on that. And then finally, translator, as you can imagine, self-explanatory. You feed it some text and it translates it to about 90 different languages. You can translate to 90 different languages, and if you need to do that kind of translation. So let's look at these things in action, shall we? We're going to do a demo now. So we're going to look at some cognitive services tools. So these are different studios that Microsoft has put out there. So Language Studio, Vision Studio, and Speech Studio. We're going to take a look at those three. There's other pages like the ones that I'm going to use, or other applications like the ones I'm going to show you that you can use for other APIs. But we're going to focus on these three for now. And then finally, we're going to look at the application itself that we built using all these APIs. Now, before we get into that, we all know how demos are, right? So I'm going to do a little prayer to make sure that this demo goes well. So let this code compile in not an hour, but a little while. Allow this application to run with the speed and zest, as this will keep users glued to my test. If my code blows up in my face, do it with style and grace. And last but not least, when all is said and run, let thy requirements have been correctly done. All right, so let's hope that this prayer actually worked. And let's start by looking at the resource group that I created for this application. So these are all the resources that I have in there. So as you can see, we have an event grid system topic that we're going to see in a little bit what's used for. That's the events that are going to get triggered every time that a file is uploaded. We have the app configuration, which has all our configuration values. We have the Cosmos DB account, which has our database, our key vault, the storage account, which has our storage container, and then the cognitive services account. So this is a multi-service account. So that means that with the same key, I can access different services. There are certain services, I believe translator is one of them, which requires a separate key. But for some of the other ones, you can just use the same key to access all of them. So let's look at the Vision Studio first. I said that I was going to show you some tools that you can use to play around with. Now, these are great if you don't want to write any code, but you want to test these APIs to make sure that they're going to work for your scenario. So as you can see here from Vision Studio, there's different functionality that you can test. And again, what I'm going to show you today is using the free tier of the services. So you can play with this, make sure that it works, check out every functionality that is available without having to incur in any sort of cost most of the time. So extract text from images. So we're going to try it out. We're just going to use one of the default ones. So you feed it to the API, we click on it. It's doing the processing over here. And there you go. So here's the text that appears there. You must be the change you wish to see in the world. Everything has its beauty, but not everyone sees it. Now, as you can see, this is handwriting, and it still was able to identify most of it. Now, you will notice that as we move, or as we select or hover over one of the words, it highlights it on the left-hand side. And that is because if we look at the JSON, it not only tells us what the text is, but it also gives us the boundaries or gives us the location of where that word is. So this is an example of what you're going to receive. So there's a group or an array of lines objects, which are going to tell you, again, where all these letters, all these words are. So let's look at one of them. So here's the text for that line. It must be the change you. And this is the bounding box for that. And it gives you also word by word. It also, on top of that, gives you the confidence that it has that this is the word that you are looking at. So you can do a little bit more filtering as well. If you see that the model maybe is not working properly, or you want to filter the words that the service or that the model is not very certain about, you can do filtering based on that. But really cool, like you can see here, this application, they built the functionality where you hover over the word, you can see what the word is. Now let's get out of this. Let's go to the text common objects. And we're going to pick another one of just the default that you have here. Now you can feed any sort of, any image that you have really into this application, and it will work. So you can see here, again, it's able to identify that this is a person. It's able to identify that this is a, again, another person here. It tells you where each of these things are. So identify this as a, seat, something where you can sit on. But as you can see, it has different levels of confidence about this. Even though what's pretty accurate of where all these things are, the fact that, that you have some of these objects intermingled with all of these, some of these have more confidence than others about what it is. So one thing to keep in mind as you build your applications is that you might have to look at the level of confidence that the model is returning for some of the results. So again, you can do a lot of things in here. You can detect faces in an image. As you can see, I'm going to show you real quick here. This, I don't have Face API set up properly for this vision resource, so it gives me this warning because I need to go back and set it up properly. So I'm just going to hit OK, but that's what I was mentioning, that Face API is a little bit more restricted than the other ones. So the feature one contains all the functionality that is available. If you click on some of these other ones, it just filters based on the type of functionality that you are looking at. So the other thing that I mentioned is that you can analyze images and videos. So this spatial analysis allows you to do to process video and process other inputs to do things like counting people in an area, person crossing a particular line. That I haven't tested this part of the functionality that much, but it's another thing that you have available. Now let's move on to Language Studio. So again, you see the feature part of it, which has some of these functionality available. We're going to look at the extract information, and we're going to look at the extract named entities. So if you can see here, you can specify the language that you're using. You can do auto detection of the language. So that's one of the cool things that these APIs have, especially the language ones, that you sometimes you don't have to specify which language it is to be able to identify sentiment or do any of the processing here. So let's look at this one. Let's do this. So let's hit run. So it was able to identify, let's look back at the text. Hello, my name is Mateo Gomez. I lost my credit card on August 17. And I would like to request this cancellation, blah, blah, blah. So it was able to identify that this is a person. This is the name of a person, confidence of 100%. You have a product, which is type card, a little bit lower on the confidence side. But you can also do, you can also identify dates. So in this case, the category is daytime, and it has a subcategory of date. So it's able to identify between dates and times separately in case you have to do that sort of processing. You have quantities, you can identify, or it can identify addresses, phone numbers. So a really cool thing that you can do. In this case, if you go down here, this is obviously exclusive of Language Studio, that you're able to hover over this and it tells you which entities it was able to extract based on the text that you provided. And if you look down here, next steps, it tells you, what resource you're using, but more importantly, it takes you or has links to view samples on GitHub to get the SDK so that you can do the code. And it has an example of the API that you can use if you want to call it as a RESTful API. Remember that in this case, it tells you that it can take you to get the SDKs, but you can also just call it as any other API that you ever encounter. Finally, we're going to look at Speech Studio. So this is a speech to text functionality, and we're just going to look at real-time speech to text. So I'm going to click here. I hope you are enjoying this presentation. So we're going to stop that. And here you can see that it transcribed exactly the words that I used. Now we're going to do something different. We're going to click on auto detect here. And we're going to select also. We're going to select those two languages and we'll see if it's able to identify the language, but it's also if it's able to identify the words that I am going to pronounce. Espero que estén disfrutando esta presentación. So we stop it. It's the exact words that I just said. So I hope you're enjoying this presentation in Spanish. It was able to completely auto detect that this is Spanish from Mexico. So it was able to differentiate even though we had English and Spanish specified. It was able to make the decision. And again, if you go to the bottom, you can see other options you can have here for other services. So really cool thing. And again, you can get started with some of these tools if you're not completely certain that these services are going to work for you. So you can get started there without having to write any code and then figure out, okay, this is going to work for us. Now let's get into writing some code and get into it. Now let's take a look real quick at some of these services. So we have the storage account, which is where the images are going to be stored. We have our containers. We have our letter images. Let's go back one step and we're going to look at the events. So as you can see here, I already have an event under my event subscriptions. I already have an event subscription here, which is a webhook. But if you wanted to add another one, so you can choose what type of schema you want to use. So event grid, for example. You can select what type of events you want to process. So in this case, Blob created or deleted, but you can choose directories created or deleted if you rename files. So you have different options to set up there. Endpoint type, you can have directly an Azure function. You can do a webhook, storage queues, service bus queue, service bus topic. It really depends on what your use case is. In this case, I just have it to a webhook, which is connected to an Azure function. Now, this is connected to an Azure function that I'm running locally. But if my Azure function was actually deployed in Azure, this endpoint would have to change to whatever endpoint that function has. And if you go to containers, you'll see here letter images. I already loaded a few images in there. Let's go back up to the resource group. We're going to look at the key vault. So if you're not familiar with key vault, I have all my secrets here. I can see the names, but as you can see, you're not able to access the secrets. So all your sensitive information or your sensitive configuration is secure. And that takes us to Azure App Configuration. So this is what I was talking about that I'm using for configuration management. We go into Configuration Explorer. You will see here all the values or all the settings that have this key icon next to them. It means that it's a key vault reference. So I have a mix of key vault references and just values that I created directly in Azure App Configuration. And it's super easy to reference key vault. So you obviously give it a name. You can specify a label. So if I want just to keep this setting to development, I can specify that. I select the key vault, and it automatically gives me a list of all the secrets that are available for me to set up. And then you will see it in a little bit, but the way that I just access this is just as in any configuration value. I just specify the name of the key, and I'm ready to go. I'm ready to use it. And this is the Cosmos DB. So we're going to look at the Data Explorer, and we're going to come back to this in a little bit. We're going to look at the code next so that you can see how easy, again, it is to interact with this Azure Cognitive Services APIs. So we're going to go up to the top of this. I'm going to start actually by showing you the app configuration settings. So if you want to use this in an Azure function, you need to add this startup to the function itself. And here I am getting the connection string from an environment variable, but you can also use your user secrets to configure this value. And then when you deploy it, you can configure this as either an environment value or a secret. So if I were to go to my settings, so this is the labels that I'm going to filter by. So I want all the keys that don't have a label in anything that is in development. I'm also configuring access to key vault. I'm using the default Azure credential for this, but if this is an application that you are actually going to deploy out in the real world, you probably want to use one of the other options for Azure credentials. Now let's look back at the code. So this is the blob trigger that I have configured. I specified this is the name of the container, and then it's going to be the name of the blob itself. The source is event grid, and the connection is this connection string right here. And what this function is doing, like I said, it's only doing a few different things here. This on top is where we're calling our cognitive services libraries. So first of all, we're going to extract the text. So you have the option of either passing a stream of the image, or you can also pass a URL, and you can also extract the text either way. So I am calling my Vision client. And if we go in here, we are authenticating using the credentials that were passed with the key and endpoint, which I'm using or I'm getting from the configuration. And then I'm sending the image stream, and we're calling this read and stream async. So this is what we're calling, this is part of the SDK for the Vision API. This was installed as a NuGet package, and as you can see, I don't have to write the code to call it as a RESTful API. I can just use methods in that SDK. So if you look at it here, whoops. So analyze image async, you're gonna analyze image by domain. There's different methods that are already built for you that you can just call, and you get the results without having to write a lot of code. And you automatically have AI functionality like optical character recognition in your application. Now, one thing that I'm doing here is that the extraction of the text is not instantaneous, so sometimes you have to wait until the operation is completed. So when you call this, you get this text headers result, and then you get an operation ID. So what you have to do is you need to wait, or need to call this get results until obviously the results are ready. Now what we could have done is maybe put it as a separate function maybe, but in this case I wanted to keep it simple so that I could extract the text in just one function. So finally, when the extraction is completed, we then get the results. We get a list of lines. In this case, I'm just keeping it simple and just extracting the lines. I'm not extracting, or I'm not I'm not getting the position of where the text is or the individual words are. But as you saw in Visual Studio, that is an option that you have if that's something that you need to do. So now if we come back to the main function, we call extract text. Now we get our list of lines. And then we're going to detect the language in the text. So we're going to feed the list of lines, and then we're just going to call another API or another method, which is part of the API or the language API, detect language async. We get a response based on the document that we pass, and then we just get the name of the language that was detected. This case is going to return English or French. You can also return, it also returns the ISO name if that's what you want to store. But again, very easy, one line of code, and you are able to feed or to detect the language of the text that you are passing to this API. Really, really cool stuff. So needs attention. This is a flag that is going to tell us, again, if the letter needs a little bit more attention or it has a negative sentiment. So in this case, we are calling the analyze sentiment functionality from the language API. So again, this is part of the SDK for the language API. We're just passing the document to the analyze sentiment async, and we're getting a response that has each of these sentences and what is the sentiment that those sentences have. So if it is a negative sentiment, it also returns the percentage or the score for each of the sentiments. So it's 90% positive or 70% positive, things like that, so that you can do a little bit more filtering in your application if you need. Now here we're just keeping it very simple. If there's any sort of negative sentiment, then we are returning we're returning a true for this method. In reality, maybe we need to narrow it down to a certain confidence score, but we're just keeping it simple for now. And then finally, this get items, it does the entity recognition. So it calls the recognized entities. So recognize entities async. This is part of the SDK for the language API again. And where we are taking is the text, the category, and then the confidence score. In this case, we do want to filter it a little bit so that we can try to actually be a little bit more accurate with the toys or what the people are asking Santa to get them for Christmas. So what we are doing here is we are just getting every word or anything that has a category of product and has a score, a confidence score of more than 70%. That's what we are returning to as the products are the things that people are asking Santa for. And then we're just creating a Santa letter object. We are creating, this is the information that we are going to store in Cosmos DB. We're going to see that in a little bit. And then we're just calling this save letter, which behind the scenes calls Cosmos DB and stores that in the application. So let's run this. Let's see what the dashboard application looks like. We're gonna give it a minute. Hopefully, my prayer worked and I actually don't have any issues with running the application. Now, in the meantime, just in time. So you see here, this is a Blazor application, very simple. We just have a grid with the letters that have been processed. And then if you click on one of these rows, you can go and look at the image and look at the text so that, again, Santa can read the letters if he actually, wanted to go through all of them. So right now, because these are, obviously, some of them have the addresses and the actual names of the people are sensitive data. I don't have that information. So I'm just keeping it simple in the grid, just showing the file name and a flag for whether it needs attention or not. Also, there's another flag, we'll see that in a little bit, that determines if the letter has been read or not. So every time that Santa goes to one of these records as additional functionality, it can mark it as red and we can remove it from the grid. Now, if we click on one of these, goes to the details, you'll see here that this is one that is marked as needs attention. As you can see, this little guy is going through a rough patch because his mom passed. The application was able, or the API was able to detect that sentiment in the letter, which is what is allowing us to show that, you know, hey, let's take a look at this and put a little bit more attention to this one. Now, another really cool thing is that you'll see this. This is an example of a letter that is actually written in Spanish. The API was still able to detect that this is something that has negative sentiment because it marked it as negative, not that it's something negative because this is saying that the daughter of this person is disabled. So again, it's something that Santa might want to take a little bit more attention to. We go to one that doesn't have any negative sentiment or is not marked for needs attention. You see here, it's a very, very positive, very happy letter from a kid that is still asking for some things for Santa, but it doesn't need that additional processing that we put on the other ones. Now let's take a look at the records in Azure Cosmos DB. So we have the letters here. These are the items that we have stored. And we're going to look here. This is one of the letters that we just saw that is in Spanish. So you'll see here that it was able to detect that the language is Spanish. So we could, in theory, add some functionality to the application so that if the language is not English, we can call translator and translate that to English if that's something that we had to do. Now, the other really cool thing is that without doing the translation, it was able to determine that the requested items are clothes, shoes, a coat, and a tablet. And if we go up here and we look at the letter, it says that that she wishes that could help with artwork supplies, which is one that was missed. But if we look at the other ones, it says clothes, shoes, and coat, and down here somewhere, and here is the tablet. So it was able to identify 4 out of 5, which is really, really good if we want to, again, help out Santa with some of the processing of these letters, with, you know, getting him out the door a lot easier, have all the toys that the kids ask for, quicker as well. So you might still a little bit of human intervention to make sure that our list is it's proper and that it has everything that the kids ask for. But it's really, really cool that even though it's not in English, it's in a different language, it's still able to do all that processing that we wanted it to do. Really cool stuff. So you'll see here, we have this is red flag that we can mark if once the letter is red. I have also this is letter flag in here because I intentionally fed an image that doesn't have any text into it. So that's why this content array is empty. And then we were able to mark that because we didn't get any text back, this is not a letter. So we're not gonna show that in our dashboard application because that's not something that Santa needs to be worried about. So if something gets uploaded by mistake into our storage container, we don't have to worry about that. So that is really it. As you can see, Azure Cognitive Services allows you to do very, very cool things in a very easy, very quick manner. If you've ever interacted with any other SDKs or any other APIs, you can see that you don't have to go through a lot of things, or you don't have to do through a lot of work to do something like text extraction, speech to text, text to speech, all the functionality that we talked about that I mentioned during the presentation. It's most of the time a few lines of code and you are up and running, which is great for developers, and it's great if, again, you do not have the resources to build your own models. I hope you really enjoyed this presentation. I hope that this presentation made you curious about Azure Cognitive Services. Again, I would love to hear from you. My name is Sam Gomez. Reach out to me. We'll love to answer any questions that you have about Azure Cognitive Services or any of the services that you saw on this presentation. Thank you. Merry Christmas.